Hello again, everybody. How was your lunch? I'm sure it was fantastic. Some people still outside. Come in, ladies and gentlemen. Do come in. We're about to start. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and managed to do some networking at the same time. Let's talk sustainable investments. They reportedly totaled, as Julia was saying in the last session, $35.3 trillion in 2020. While taking a more holistic approach to sustainability is the only way to ensure our future, there are significant cost implications, including the effect of taxation and inflation rates. How is the sector adapting to these requirements, and how are regulators and policymakers reacting? To moderate the next few sessions, please welcome Executive Editor at The Points Guy, that's Scott Mayovitz, and his first panel.
Do you go by one every day? Okay. Well, good afternoon. It is a tough act following lunch, but think about it this way, we're that much closer to the cocktail party. Thanks for coming back in and joining us. I want to thank the panel, first of all. We've got, Kata, Juan Enrique, and Bethany, who are here to talk about the money behind making investments here in sustainability. And just for those of you who don't know my background, I used to cover Wall Street investments and now cover travel, and I've covered the business of it. I'm a skeptic by nature. So I'm going to kick us off right now by just talking about, we talked about a lot of great things this morning, how we can change the world, how we can be better in tourism. When it comes down to it at the end of the day, money is important. How do you actually think about making such investments and returning a profit? So, Bethany.
I think it's a great question, and I think the discussions this morning have led us to be here and think critically about the investment side of our industry and the investment side of sustainability. And I think, Scott, it's a great comment you made to open it up to be skeptical. And I think when we're skeptical, we think more critically. And when we think about the future of the industry and about what the future of sustainability means, I think from a money standpoint, we have to think about seed funding the future. So how institutional investors, how the public sector and private sector come together to invest in this industry in sustainable ways so that we see the realization of that growth in the future for the next generations. And also further defining what it means to invest sustainably. So it's more than environment, it's more than community, it's all of those things put together, and bringing the right people to the table to facilitate some of those conversations, which I think this group up here and in this room is really here to do.
So perfect segue into bringing the right people. From the other side of it, when you start talking about tourism, your job is to get people to invest, get people to put money back into a community and bring more visitors. How does sustainability factor into that? And particularly when you start looking at financing, what can a tourism organization, what can the government actually do?
Well, first of all, thank you for the time. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I will speak in Spanish because there are some specific data that I would like to say it on my language.
I want to share with you that definitely I think that sustainability is something about justice. And when I'm talking about justice, we're talking about going back to basics. We have spent a lot of years seeing how constructions or investments have been destroying certain situations, not only the ecosystem, but communities. And I think that sustainability and investment has to do with justice. That requires now not only the environment, but the future generation that are going to be visiting different parts of the world. So what are the challenges? First of all, we need public policy from the government side. I think that this situation of not being united or not visualizing things from one angle, that has to be done for. We need to have the private and public sectors together, working together in a common goal. I was just listening to the previous presentation that has hotels, and he was mentioning that it was important they work sometimes without the government, and I think that sustainability and inclusion has to be focused on that. I am speaking to you in Spanish, so this is an issue of inclusion and sustainability, allowing things to work as they are without having to undo what's done. And I think that's one of the parts that we all should take as a challenge, open our minds. As governments, we need to create conditions and culture and essence so that people can visualize from their community sustainability and see it as more profit and better for the community. A better service means higher profits. But when you take care of the ecosystem, it creates unique opportunities for your community. In Nayarit, we have an example of that. They have very high prices, but they offer a better community, and they also offer justice for all of the people that depend on tourism to live and survive.
As we talk about sort of that justice and getting people to survive as part of this community, is this something that is just available to those who can afford it? Is this just a high-end resort destination while the budget traveler is going to have to sacrifice, whether it's sustainability or DEI efforts? Where does that fall on the scale?
If you allow me, I want to share. I am here wearing this shirt that comes from Nayarit. People from Nayarit. This is one of our original people. It was the last of the people that were conquered by the Spanish. So this is sustainability. This is a way of giving them an opportunity to have a business. Maybe some markets are not for everyone, but I think we can do that. If you are part of a big resort chain, you can't pay for a room, but you can still be part of the situation, and you can generate situations for the betterment of his family, for the aspirations of that family, for the education of that family are going to be important. So maybe there are people that are not able to pay the money that is asked from all these hotels. Many of the economic situations that come from tourism is going to be important for the growth of the community.
Thank you. Kai, I'll switch to you for a second. The cost can be high. Can you kind of break down for us some of the issues in the sector? What are the major financial costs out there? How do you actually break that down when looking at projects?
Sure, thank you. And I think the first thing I would like to just put out there to think about is that investing in sustainability is not all that different to investing in anything else. Not that different investing in capacity. We expect that there will be an upfront cost and there will be a payback over time. And I think that's a real mental hurdle for some people, that it's seen as punishment. You are genuinely making an investment and you will make a return. So the major costs, in my experience, are, as with any project, research, installing and retrofitting new infrastructure, and importantly, often where the implementation comes in is actually switching the operational processes and the people skills that are required to move to new ways of working, new technologies. But very importantly, and this is often what gets missed, already there are zero cost sustainability investments or very low cost investments, and I'm sure we'll go into some of those examples that exist, which make this a very, very straightforward and very compelling business case. In other situations, granted, there will be more of an upfront investment required where there will be need for things like loan guarantees or partnerships and so on. But many of the so-called sustainability investments already make good financial sense, and that's the way that investors are thinking about it and should be thinking about it.
So you opened up the can of worms. Let's go into some examples. What is something that's easy to do and something that's really hard to do? And
I'll pick the easy one. Let me go with the easy one.
Let's start and work on back.
Energy efficiency, no-brainer, really no-brainer. It has so many benefits. Straight away a P&L benefit, but also in many cases, I mean, to get really specific, changing out lighting. Not only does it have an overnight impact, but it's also a very good employment generator, typically for low and mid-skilled workers. So you get a double benefit. They're doing productive work, and overnight you start to see a reduction in your operating costs. Purchased electricity is a massive cost for everybody in the tourism ecosystem. So if you can take those little steps and do it in a way that provides job opportunities, that's a really, really easy one. I'll leave the hard ones to my panelists.
You know, I think just to add to some of that, the mindset change, I think, is an investment up front. As Katja mentioned, that the opportunity to change how we think is first and foremost, and the cost of not doing this is greater than the cost of making the investment up front. It was mentioned earlier in one of the panels about there being upfront and leading the way with policy, and I know part of the discussion is about regulators and setting policy and criteria. And defining what we want, I think, is a huge part of this, so that we can get to some of the bigger challenges, so that we can understand what new metrics do we want and need to see success on, redefining what some of those metrics are. You know, you mentioned having community and having the flow through of the dollar go all the way through the ecosystem. If we don't put that forward as something we want to see measured successfully, then it won't remain a priority. So I think we have to push as an industry to say these are the things, these are the metrics for success. And those will change over time, and that's okay to reevaluate. But I think starting that conversation and going deeper is important.
Who should pay for this? Is it the developers? Is it the guest? Is it the government? Can I get from each of you?
I think that obviously there's cost sharing that has to go into this. And what we've seen is that in this value chain system, consumers and travelers are more and more interested in this. There's a point at which they maybe stop. And where they say, you know, this is too much for me, and we already talked about sort of the luxury traveler can have a certain kind of experience versus everybody else in the travel ecosystem. So how do we make this something that all consumers can buy into? And I think, again, that's part of mindset. But first and foremost, I think, again, policymakers, regulators, public sector has to set the stage of what we want to see from private sector and continue to foster those conversations. So ultimately, it ends up being sharing in cost, but sharing equitably across all of those different parts of the ecosystem, I think, is where we have to find balance in every destination.
Es una situación compartida.
It's something that's shared today. Development, as I just mentioned, requires collectivity. We need for the government to see from the hotel out to that space that provides services for tourists from the hotel out. We need connectivity so that people that work at the hotel can get there fast. But we need to create conditions and culture in schools and universities, and we need to show people that want to become part of this sector that we need sustainability, that you need to be part of it, because modernization is here. We are in a different phase from years ago. Any impact that we have today is going to be negatively seen by the consumers and the community. And of course, we have social media where we see something immediately. We were seeing images of nature, animals, everything. You need to be very careful with those images, so the government has to create and structure regulation, generate legislation, and work with the private sector so that rules are followed and you don't want a negative impact in our destination. We need to be aware of tourism, and we're going to get better investment if we do that, because investors are looking for places where their investments can grow. You don't want to see your investment become a loss because priorities are not set correctly.
Same question.
Yeah, so it's a complex question. It sounds simple, but I'd probably think about it in terms of the different stakeholder groups and Bethany's point about sharing the cost equitably. You might think about it in terms of where it is a pension fund or an infrastructure fund who is making a conscious investment decision, then frankly they should be paying for it, and they know the risks they're taking on, they know the returns that they are expecting, and we know from the very, very large sums already cited that there's a huge appetite for this. So there is huge investment appetite for sustainability-linked transition investments. In those cases, pretty clear, private money or infrastructure funds are very happy to pay the cost. At the consumer end, there is also a need and a rationale for this idea of contributing and paying for your own impacts. And I really liked the sustainability starts with me sentiment, because we're not only the industry, but we're also travelers ourselves. And I think there are great opportunities, and my boss John mentioned the share value projects earlier, where we are seeing great opportunities where tourists can take ownership in protecting destinations, in maintaining handicrafts, in rebuilding coral reefs. And in those cases, I think it's absolutely right that the tourist who can afford to pay for it should pay for it. I think it's the right thing to do, and any one of us who can afford to should take ownership and lead by example. The big elephant in the room, as I see it, is where there is a genuine mismatch or a market failure, which is where government steps in. And just to pick an example that's very close to my heart, I look after an aviation division, and obviously we have huge sustainability challenges, primarily around decarbonization. Number one contributor to aviation's impact is, of course, the fuel used. We know that there are solutions available in terms of sustainable aviation fuel. We also know that there are new technologies emerging. The challenge is that it's an industry in its infancy, very similar to the wind and solar industry 20 years ago. It was so expensive, nobody would invest in it. We're in a similar situation now, and what we see is that in markets such as California, for example, where there are policies and incentives available to help close the gap between production cost and ability to pay, it starts to get that ball rolling. Once you build momentum and as you get to scale up, prices will come down. But these are the instances where it's absolutely right that policymakers step in, provide the right incentives, whether that's carrot or stick, it will depend on what's appropriate, but then that gets things started. Once we get to sufficient scale, then as in other industries, the profit motive will prevail and will sustain things forward.
You touched on my favorite subject, so bear with us for a second while we jump into sustainable aviation fuel for 1 minute. I promise just one. My years of covering it, one of the biggest things that I've been told, it's very much like your Tesla supercharger issue, there's just not the infrastructure set up. So even if we were to make sustainable aviation fuel the right cost and available, just in the US alone, we have 500 commercial airports. And some of them are near some of those big production spots. Some of them you'd have to truck in the fuel and basically negate all of those carbon savings. How do you set up an infrastructure? And that's something that only government can do, especially when you start looking globally.
So, without completely going off on a tangent, and I'm very happy to talk about this over cocktails, I could talk about this literally for hours, but I'll try and keep it brief. First thing to debunk, sustainable aviation fuels chemically virtually identical to Jet A1. They drop into the system. So yes, you might have to truck it in if you haven't got a refinery in your doorstep, but you plonk it into the fuel system. It gets blended, it goes into the aircraft. At the point of fueling, nobody knows where it came from. So really, it's not like hydrogen, which genuinely there are challenges around how you get it to the aircraft, not insurmountable. But it is very easy once you have it to the airport to uplift. The biggest challenge at the moment is to produce enough. And it's a fantastic opportunity. It needs to be unlocked, the financing of it. There's a huge amount of appetite and interest, but whilst the cost of production is around 4 times the cost of what the alternative is in terms of fossil fuel sources, there has to be mechanisms in there. And I will just call out and recognize that there's a reason that 90+% of SAF uplifted today is from California. You just have to follow the money. It makes sense. People are doing this profitably. Airlines are not charities. They are making commercial decisions, and it makes sense. There are huge numbers of governments and policymakers currently actively trying to figure this out. The EU's going another way. But this is the only thing that's going to help decarbonize aviation within the next 15 years. Thereafter, we will have hydrogen, electric aircraft, other things, but nothing will have an overnight impact as quickly as SAF will, provided we're able to make enough of it.
We'll continue that.
Yeah, we'll take this up over cocktails.
That bring us back down to hotels and on the ground. How much of a difference do some of these government policies make? Is it tax breaks? Is it financing? What can all the tourism folks out here do to attract projects?
Yeah, when we work with different destinations and with different private sector investors who are looking at projects or looking at hotel development, they're coming to us trying to figure out where's the right place to invest. So who has the best incentive? Who has the best package for them to consider based on size and scale of the investment? And so they do make a big difference. So looking across what we can offer from a governmental standpoint of how long does that tax break last? How significant is the break? And it can be above and beyond just tax breaks themselves, but what other incentives might actually be cash investment from public sector to say this is a project we believe in from a value standpoint, something we need and want to necessitate, so we want to be part of bringing that to life. So sometimes it's more than tax breaks, it's actually the public sector getting invested and getting involved. Is a big one that we're starting to see, or allocating funds so that they can be used for horizontal infrastructure that would go towards getting the water and energy supply to the site. So the investors are much more considerate of where the right incentives are and how that might be part of their decision making, more than just where is tourism growing, but where is it going to be sustainable. Sustainable investment from a hotel standpoint is the asset going to mature in value? Is that investment going to be as profitable as I believe that it could be? And do we believe in what those different metrics might be in order to have a successful, sustainable investment?
Okay. Reminder to everyone in the audience, you can take out your phones, go into that app, and ask a question of our panelists. While my mom likes to tell me I'm the smartest person in the room, trust me, I am far from it. Please, please, bring your questions forward. Okay. Enrique, one of the things you talked about was social media. I want to come back to that. How do you, for a destination, highlight some of the great sustainable things that you and the partners are doing so that consumers or tourists will come and visit and take advantage of those?
Ahorita justamente estamos
Currently, we are doing what you saw today in the presentation, the main presentation, showing many of the natural attractions of the destination. And it is a situation that it is very important to share that today tourism has changed so much. And I was listening to some comments about the pandemic and what happened post-pandemic. And the reality is that we live in a completely different moment. And nowadays, the way that we are issuing all the situations with the media is showing the hospitality through the recovery and enhancing and helping with the attractions that we have today. And it is important, and it is a huge challenge for all the governments. And what you mentioned earlier regarding the investment and what is required for them to come to invest. And then Mexico is completely different to the United States and different to UK and different to Spain. Each country has their own way of having their public policy and investment. The investors should take into consideration what policies will be there. And for example, today in Mexico, they have prohibited bullfighting. And for many years, this was not happening. So globalization, even though we believe that today we are 100% connected, there are still many countries where it has been very difficult for them to have this openness, because they consider that at the end of the day, prohibiting some situations or regulating some situations does not go together with investment. And they say, if I prohibit this, then if I don't have this situation, then I will not allow this, so I will lose the investment, and I need the growth. So what do we have to do as a government, as a public sector? We need to show not only tourism or hotels and people drinking a piña colada or a margarita, because I come from Mexico, of course, you need to have tequila and margaritas, but we need to show them at the end of the day what we have, the mangroves, all these places as they are, and create in the tourists that sense of wanting to go to the destination, not for the feeling, but because of the environment and the situation around the destination. And that's where this investment situation comes. And definitely being updated to public policies in other parts of the world, so we are all in agreement.
I think that's so key. As a traveler myself, I want to connect with a destination, and I want to feel like I'm someplace, not just, no offense to this beautiful conference room, but sitting in a conference room that could be anywhere else in the world. And I think that's so key. We have a question from our audience, which is, I'm going to throw it out to the entire panel. Why don't we don't always see travelers choosing more sustainable bookings? What do you recommend to help actually change that traveler behavior?
I'll start. We've sort of talked about this already a little bit, but it's absolutely a mindset change, and we have to talk about it, that the optionality that we're giving visitors maybe is too much on the option side. So we see things like carbon offsets. You can choose to pay to offset your ticket. Maybe we shouldn't be making it an offer that they can option to do that. So some of the things that we ask of the private sector when we put things out from a policy standpoint, we say, here's the criteria, you must respond to this. We don't always do that on the traveler side. And if we really believe that our destination is going to be healthy and sustainable in the future, there's certain things that we should be asking and almost demanding of our traveling public to some degree. And I think there's a point where we're going to start to get to that scale.
Anything to add?
Yo diría,
I would say that the same as was mentioned, the way we see tourism has changed. There are many situations that nowadays tourism are going to value at the time of making a reservation. And for example, I would like to share a situation in Nayarit. The investment has grown in vertical development in hotels. And today the Airbnb and some digital platforms have changed the way the tourist is coming to vacation in our state. Today, people want to rent an apartment and they don't care if it is in front of the beach or not, but they do know that it is close to the beach. And that helps us because people who are renting a home, they interact with the community and they go to the restaurant. So they don't go only to hotels, but they are looking for the environment surrounding the apartment where they are staying. So I think as the tourism starts to value those situations outside the hotel that it may be important and to connect. And we are going to see that relationship with the sustainability, the way we are building the development and the caring for the environment. They are going to select according to that. But beyond that, in terms of education, I see that some models are the same as many years ago. They are not up to date. Nowadays, that research needs to be focused on caring for the environment, the training, specialization, communities, and I think it is important to see something different in their content because the children today are going to be the tourists in the future, and we're not talking about 50 years in the future, but in 5 years, they will be leaving college and start traveling, so they will be the next tourists. And they may commit all their tourists to make a difference.
I think we are almost out of time, but I saw a virtual question that did pop in, which is something that, speaking of 5 years ago and 5 years from now, I would have never thought of seeing that. And I guess the question is, I'm sorry, it disappeared on us. What stakeholders need to be at the table? Thank you. And Kay, can you please, sorry about that.
It's all right.
Do you mind jumping in there about what stakeholders should be in there?
I mean, to try and keep it brief, as has already been mentioned, and all of us in this room know, tourism is one of the most multifaceted industries. It's not linear, it's a matrix. And therefore, the only way progress will be made, and we see this, where there is alignment from governance to the top down, from vision down to implementation, execution, that's where you can make progress. And therefore, every stakeholder needs to be at the table, but not at the same table at the same time. It would get very, very crowded, and it's not appropriate. But provided there are the right tables, and I will commend WTTC and other organizations in bringing together these relevant stakeholders, that's the only way this industry will progress. If we contrast that with something like a manufacturing, where it is much more of a linear process, this is not that. This touches too many things and it's too complex. So for it to move forward sustainably, and we didn't even go down the rabbit hole of the 3 pillars, we'll again save that for cocktails, but we have to recognize that this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all. We need public sector, we need finance, we need private enterprise, and we need the actual tourists themselves to be part of that conversation.
Well, thank you to each of our panelists. This has been fascinating. I will be sure to continue much of this conversation at cocktails. So thank you.
Thank you.